This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Hello and welcome to DBrief. I'm James Scotland.
And I'm Louise McGrath.
Thank you to everyone who enjoyed episode 1 of DBrief. For those that are new to this show, welcome. DBrief is the latest monthly business podcast from the Australian Industry Group. It's for business people with a keen interest in understanding the connection between their businesses and the broader issues of industry development, industry policy, and new government regulations. It's where the micro of your business connects with the macro of the economy, what's coming down the pipeline, what it means for your business, and what you need to know. Which means, of course, there's a lot to talk about. This month, there's actually been a heap of developments, and I'm keen to have a good chat with Louise and discuss and unpack these issues, including the recent ASEAN summit in Australia and what that means for business, the updates and changes to AUKUS and the complexities of implementing an effective defence trade across 3 sovereign nations. And there's an interesting emergent issue called SAM. Let's find out what that's about. First, though, we should catch up, Louise. We've both been overseas since our last podcast, but for different reasons. Where have you been? What have you been up to? And how are you?
I'm well, thanks, James. Yeah, so I've been in Japan to Hiroshima to see a hydrogen plant, cold hydrogen, with carbon capture and storage. And it was fascinating. We talk a lot about hydrogen. I know in some of your other podcasts you've had a lot of discussion about hydrogen. So it was really great to see it in action and to see the creation of hydrogen in practice and to unpack some of those myths. The feelings in Australia on hydrogen are pretty bipolar. It's either blind enthusiasm, yes, it's going to save everything, it will make us a manufacturing powerhouse, to, oh my God, why would you even try, over my dead body? So it's nice to see it sort of just in reality. But the visit to Japan, Japan's always interesting. It's one of our most important trading partners. I've been going there for about 20 years, and it's really interesting to see the changes culturally and socially and economically over that time. But one thing that hasn't changed is Japan's reliance on Australia for energy. We supply, I think it's around 70% of their gas, 30% of their coal. The lights are kept on in Tokyo because of Australian energy exports. So our own policy, they watch our own policy announcements around renewables, around carbon, safeguards, etc., very, very closely, because it's not theory for them. It's a very real impact potentially on their whole industrial powerhouse.
It's a great partner for us, isn't it? We talk a lot about let's build some wind farms. Well, Japan's a bunch of small islands, and they don't have any space for wind farms. And if they try and build them offshore, it's a deep water cyclone zone in a contested ocean. So it's not great for wind farms. And they don't have the same solar that we have. And of course, they tried nuclear, and that didn't work so well. So the dependence on Australia is good for us, but it's also real.
That's right. And I think sometimes we forget our responsibilities more globally. So, obviously we're very focused on our own transition to net zero and what that means in terms of policy and industry development. But we can't forget that part of our soft power or even hard power in the region is related to our energy exports and our reputation as a good partner for energy and other technology. One thing with our group, we're technology agnostic when it comes to the transition. So it was really good to see this hydrogen, carbon capture and storage in practice, because we don't want to be technology ignorant. And Japan is really investing quite heavily, as it often does, in really cutting edge technology that's cutting edge but not bleeding edge. It's they make sure it's proven before they implement it.
I imagine you're talking to people pretty senior over there. Do you get the feeling that our relationship is as strong as ever? And are the business connections as strong as ever?
I think it is. I think, we've got a number of touch points. We've got our own bilateral free trade agreement. We've got CPTPP. We've got the Quad. There's now talk about Japan joining Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which will integrate our sort of industrial bases even further. We are seen as not just a good partner in terms of, security of energy, food, etc. But, we are collaborators on these multilateral forums. So it's Japan and Australia who led the conversation on digital trade at the WTO. It's Japan and Australia who salvaged the TPP to become the CPTPP. Everyone said once Trump walked away, that was it. So, we're not just good transactional partners, but in true Japan style, we're good relationship partners.
I love that. That's great. Yeah. Well, whilst you were in Japan, I was down the road in Vietnam having a holiday, and I was wandering around the boondocks of Vietnam, having a great time. And as one of our Ds is digitalisation, you'll be pleased to know that I decided to not take my smartwatch. I figured the less things I had to recharge, the better. So I took my old analog watch. And I've got to tell you, boy, is it dumb. After wearing a smartwatch for a couple of years or for several years, this watch only told me the time, and then I had to figure it out because there was two arms pointing north and east, and I had to figure out what the time was. And it had a compass and a date, I guess. But boy, it's dumb. And it reminded me of how far we've come in digitalisation. And as business people, I think we should, the lesson for me was, as business people, we should try and keep in mind that things are happening fast. We're getting used to a digitalised economy. And as business people, we need to keep up.
Yeah. And it's changing workplaces. Obviously, with this whole debate around work from home, work from anywhere. I was chatting to a colleague the other day because, when we were in our 20s and at AR Group, because we've both been here far too long, we used to be out all day seeing members, and then you'd have to come back to the office until about 7 o'clock at night because this is where the emails were kept. That was the only way you could access your emails was coming back to the office. And not just emails, but the little scraps of paper that were left on your desk, which were phone messages, because no one could reach you. I don't think I'm that old that it should be so archaic. But, I think things are happening quickly. And I think what business people forget is at home, like as you've done, you've embraced digitalisation with your watch and it's changed the way you probably exercise and think. We need to take those lessons back into the workplace and production as soon as possible.
Yeah, and understand that that's what the end user, the consumer, is expecting, and you're the consumer. Recognise how we see the world now. Yeah, I mean, my watch didn't even tell me my heart rate or how far I'd walked that day or anything. It was so dumb. The other thing I noticed was that Vietnam is industrialising quickly. I'm not surprised by this because I've been working with AI Group, other parts of AI Group on the industrialisation of Vietnam. When I was in Hanoi in the north, we drove out to a remote area to go for a hike, and there was industrial parks and factories and all sorts of modern businesses being built out there. And the relevance of this is that, it's a lot of opportunities for Australia, but also because they need a lot of electricity. They need a lot of new power. For the first time ever, the north of Vietnam needs to have electric light, and they need to have air conditioning. It's taking a lot of power. There's some real opportunities, isn't there, Louise?
There's huge opportunities in Vietnam. And in terms of, the region with ASEAN or Asia Pacific, Vietnam's a real standout. It's totally, even though it hasn't changed its structure of government, it's still, centrally controlled government. It's really embraced market liberalisation. It's been proactive in joining CPTPP. It's done an FTA with the EU. It's really embraced trade and the benefits of trade, which is why so many of our members are interested in Vietnam. We've talked about diversification, and a lot of companies are thinking, well, should I rely so much on China? It's our number one trading partner in Australia. And so a lot of companies have a China plus one strategy. Well, that plus one is often Vietnam. And that's because of the rapid change, the growing middle class, the rapid industrialisation, and it's starting to prove itself as a good partner.
The other thing is exciting about a good partner. There's no doubt there's a good partner because it feels like we can deal with them quite easily. They can deal with us. There's a natural relationship despite the difference in political structures. I read recently that the government of Vietnam, this is a quote, the government of Vietnam expects power consumption to grow 10 to 12% annually through 2030, one of the fastest growing power consumption growth rates in Asia. And much of that growth will be in the former agricultural area of North Vietnam. So we've got a few things going on, diversifying our reliance on other countries, plus the opportunities of the decarbonisation sector. What's Australia doing? Apart from the trade agreements, are we heading over there? How are we building relationships with Vietnam?
So our group had a trade delegation probably around the same time you were there. Shirley and one of our colleagues took a really senior delegation looking at energy, defence, civil security, those sorts of high-tech companies. And they found lots of great opportunities, really warm welcome. And I think even the local diplomats were surprised at the high-level meetings that Shirley managed to get. But it just showed, all the work that's been done at federal level to build this relationship. We've got a special economic partnership agreement now. All the work at the ASEAN summit, as you mentioned, we're not the only country that has ASEAN summits, but I think that our efforts in this area to improve our soft power across all of ASEAN are being well received and taken at face value, that it is about not controlling anyone, not making people have a choice, but working with the region to ensure, economic prosperity on a collaborative level.
Well, all this talk of Japan and Vietnam and the opportunities in the power sector brings us to the homework that you sent us last episode. One of the things you did is that you recommended we read AI Group's recently released research notes on the decarbonisation transition. Not a great title, but at least it says what it's supposed to be about. Now, I read the report, and one excerpt stood out to me. It said, the results might surprise you of the research into decarbonisation. The results might surprise you. 3/4 of Australia's energy use is by industry, not household. We've been very successful at improving energy efficiency, but not achieved much when it comes to electrification. And while we've quadrupled renewables in just a decade, we're still a long way to go to meet our energy needs for net zero sources. So in other words, whilst there's opportunities with our near neighbours, we've also got some challenges locally.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you read the report, James, and I hope others did. Look, I found it a really interesting report because, everything is personal, everything is local, and so you might look out and see solar panels on everyone's roof and people recycling, et cetera, and think, well, we're doing all the right thing. We're well on track to get to net zero by 2050. But as this report showed, what households do, is good and important, but it's not the only answer. And with 3/4 of Australia's energy use by industrials, some of that will be fixed by renewables or met by renewables and electrification. But making steel, iron, all that smelting, all those forges, that's really intense energy, and it's hard to find a non-fossil fuel, other than hydrogen potentially, solution to that. And the other homework we gave was to read our budget submission. The budget will be released in May. And
yeah, it's coming soon.
Yes, and we've been doing, in addition to the budget submission where we called on some changes, we've also been doing some other sort of work behind the scenes, trying to get the government to see that, if they are going to provide any sort of industrial support, it needs to be in helping industry to make this transition. It's not going to be all about heat pumps. That's not going to be the solution to everything. It's going to be around sensors, around digitalisation, AI in production, because we, as we've said before, we're just not going to get to decarbonisation unless we get to digitalisation. But all that's expensive, and it's an engineering task, and some companies will need some financial assistance to get them across the line there.
Yes, David Martin, our colleague, says all the time, there's no decarbonisation without digitalisation, which is why those two things are so important to this podcast. We're also going to see what you just mentioned there, that there's two sides of this equation. One is energy efficiency, getting the maximum out of it through measuring and through understanding where our energy is being used and what sort of energy we're using. But the other one is actually to find new energy sources, and that's going to be the challenging part, it would appear.
Yeah, and I think to get it to scale and connected to the grid is going to be the challenge. But, we've had challenges in the past and we've met them. I feel optimistic and hopeful that we will get there. I think we think about, and I use this example a lot, the transition from steam to electricity. It actually took factories 50 years compared to households to make that transition because, in the house, it wasn't that challenging. But in factories, you have to completely change your production lines. You have to rearrange factories to meet the new energy sources. You've got more freedom now. You're not tied to where the wood stove is. And I think that's where we'll get to with this as well.
Yeah, and when the business case becomes obvious, and the business case is becoming obvious as renewable energy, the price of renewable energy drops, something that we can pick up in future episodes, no doubt. So let's get to the issue of the month. And the biggest one is a follow-on from what we've been discussing. Last month, Australia hosted the ASEAN Summit in Melbourne. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is seen by many as a critically important relationship for both security and for business reasons, which you've already mentioned in this conversation. Prime Minister Albanese said the Australian ASEAN engagement is important because, quote, 1 in 4 jobs in Australia depend on foreign trade. And Foreign Minister Penny Wong said, what happens in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the Mekong sub-region, the Indo-Pacific affects us all. So we hear a lot about ASEAN, Louise. What's it all about and what does it mean for business?
Well, ASEAN is an important region. We often group it together. It's not, I think people hear about ASEAN and think, oh, is it like the EU? It's not. It's an association. They still have sovereign governments. They don't, while they work collaboratively, they still make independent decisions. Our free trade agreement with Australia, New Zealand and ASEAN is probably one of the most successful ones that I've witnessed. I mean, it's the companies or our members who use that FTA is substantial. In fact, I think even ASEAN companies use that FTA for intra-ASEAN trade, not even their own ASEAN FTA. So it's a really important free trade agreement. It really enables companies to set up a footprint in the region and to, shift some costs, of course, but also get closer to their customers, get closer to their suppliers and take advantage of the booming middle class. I mean, if you would have seen in Vietnam, when I think every time I go to Vietnam, I see these, those old tiny women who were probably around during the war. And I think, what have they seen? What transformation have they seen in that country where, just devastated by war and now, glass towers, highly digitalized, rich, wealthy, emerging middle class, engaged with the world. It's really quite extraordinary. And that is replicated across Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, that young, sort of emerging middle class really driving so many changes and developing their own technology in, apps, digital platforms. There are, many digital unicorns, as many digital unicorns coming out of Indonesia as there are Australia. And I think people really need to have a look at the region individually and as a collective.
I always get a chuckle when I'm walking through an airport, particularly a domestic airport in somewhere like, Vietnam or Thailand, and you see the Buddhist monks on their phones, walking along on their phones. But what you're right. I was in Munich and they rebuilt Munich after World War II, but in Vietnam, they constructed a new Vietnam and it's exciting to see whilst it still kept the same flavour. It's just good and good for us to be involved. The other issue that happened this month was, of course, AUKUS. So the AUKUS, Australian, UK, US deal, is well known as an agreement for those 3 countries to work together to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. But AUKUS is much more than that. It's a comprehensive trade and defence industry arrangement that encourages and enables the 3 countries and other partners to build links that support a comprehensive defence industry across the Allies. AUKUS provides opportunities, but it's also really complex and quite challenging. For a start, each country has different export rules and regulations. And then there's the very complex US agreement called the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, Louise, in our last episode of Debrief, you made the point that there's always plenty of opportunities, but it's the implementation where success or failure lives. So what's the current story? What's happening with AUKUS and industry policy and Australian business? Where are we at?
Well, yeah, so AUKUS is, a lot of focus on the nuclear submarines, which is a very important part for Australia. And, there's all sorts of points being made about that. The real focus, though, for AI Group is what's called Pillar 2, which is the integration of the industrial supply base of the three countries. And it sounds very simple and you think, oh, yes, that's great. But, of course, when you get into the detail, it does mean that our export rules need to be aligned. Otherwise, it's just simply not going to work. And we all nodded sagely, saying, yes, 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 this all, it sounds great. And then now the rubber hits the road and it's a bit more challenging than we expected. So the new export control rules have been expanded to include services and also to include domestic supply. So in the past, I've spoken to a lot of our members exporting what's called dual-use products, so products that aren't specifically defence products, so they're not actual missiles, but they could be used in, the theatre of war or in creating weapons of mass destruction. Even ISIS, I think, probably use Teams or something, so I think there's a lot of technology that's used that gets captured. I remember speaking to Woodside a couple of years ago, shocked that one of their pieces of equipment used for mining was captured under defence export control. So it's pretty broad. Now that it includes services, which, when you think about it, makes sense, because what is a product, what is a service, it's all pretty interlinked these days. And so...
the servitization of products.
That's right. And especially now with technology and... as you say, servitization. So although it's been a bit painful, it does make sense when you think about it. It just means that members and companies will need to get across it. We've putting out a member fact sheet, both on this and on SAMS, which we'll talk about in a minute. So if you're a member and you're listening to this and it's not in your email, give us an email us at industry.policy@aigroup.com.au and we'll make sure you get it. But it's just a good introductory statement on what these issues are and where you should go looking for more information if it will affect your business.
Yeah, good tip, because there's a quite significant changes here. One of the ones that jumped out at me is that for a while there's been this issue of products that can be adapted for military use. Now it's grabbing what you said is the dual use. It doesn't have to be adapted. It just can be used for war as well as mining or for anything else. It's quite a significant change.
Yeah, the reach is much broader now, and especially now that there's domestic supply. And whereas in the past, when you're exporting, that doesn't happen every day. And so companies are a bit more aware, and someone, a freight forwarder or someone might say, hey, do you have your export certificate for this? And so then they'll go off on that tangent. But if it's domestic supply, you're not may not have the same trigger. So it's really, companies really have to be alert that they're not accidentally breaking this new regulation.
Yeah, and that's the point. So pay attention. You can accidentally do it, and there's no forgiveness when it comes to defence issues. Speaking of which, if we're talking about having three sovereign countries working together on a defence industry, and there's a digital world going on there, one of the things we really should do is we should safeguard our military secrets. It's a reasonably obvious thing. Australia has recently made some steps in that way, but there's some complexities to it. Can you unpack this for me? When I heard about it, I went, oh my goodness, this is much more complex than I realised.
Yeah, it's pretty significant, and I'm surprised there isn't more coverage on it, but I guess that's why our podcast exists. So it's not really directly linked to AUKUS. It's around sort of upgrade, all sorts of this, the geostrategic environment now, and there's a lot more nervousness and trying to control things. So SAMS, as you said, safe.
Well, I mean, I guess in that point, every business is worried about cybersecurity. This is just the intelligence region of Australia being more concerned about their part of cybersecurity, I guess. Is that an easy way of explaining it?
Well, it's not even cybersecurity because it's what's in someone's head, or it may or may not be in their head. So SAMS rules, Safeguard of Military Secrets, means that any former employee of Australian Defence Force, anyone, the Australian the Department of Defence, uniform or non-uniform, are not able to provide any service or work or information to any foreign entity that is controlled by a foreign state. So that's a very complicated way to say any state-owned enterprise that has control over the board of another company is now considered a foreign entity, which means that if you worked for Defence, you're a reservist, all sorts of former servicemen, you're no longer now allowed to work. So what does that mean? Companies in Australia, like Toll, which has a part ownership by Japanese Post, which is a state-owned enterprise, Qenos, which has ownership from state-owned enterprise in China, Optus with Singtel, which is Singaporean government controlled, and Thales, which is French government links. These are all very good, responsible Australian companies who, through all sorts of strategic and financial and business reasons, have a state-owned link. It means that if you worked for Defence, if you were a serviceman, or you are now no longer able to either work for them or to work for another company and provide service without a permit. And doing so without a permit, and if, all sorts of things happen, you're risking 20 years in jail. So it's quite significant for a membership organisation like AI Group. We have all sorts of members, such as those mentioned and others. And so anyone on our staff who has a defence background now will be either restricted from talking to those members, or we'll have to get permits. Now, you can just think the scale of this. I mean, just pause for a moment and think of all the people who've got a background in defence. It's quite extraordinary. What jobs, what work are they doing? And I mean, that it doesn't need to be related to defence or military. They could be, selling real estate and, unable to deliver that service to these sorts of companies without a permit by the minister. So it's quite significant. As I said, there's member advice going out. So if you haven't received it and you're a member, please email us. We're working out what it means for us and our employees at the same time. So we're all in this boat together at the moment. And but we're also building up some services and fact sheets, etc., to help members transact this. And certainly if you need that extra consulting support, we're here to help as well.
It's a staggering sort of story, much more complex, as I said. It's one of those things where I may have been in communications in the Defence Force. I get hired by international comms company to go over to Holland and talk to them about what's going on in Australia. And they say, well, you better check and make sure that, SAMS is okay with that. And as business people, we say, well, it's a bit more complex than I really wanted.
And I think that's it. It's a complexity. I mean, you take companies on face value. You don't necessarily need to know where their ownership structure is, who controls over 50% of their board. These aren't really questions you naturally ask, but you're going to have to. And while the risk is on the individual, they would have an expectation, we believe, on their employer that their employer will not put them at risk of having to potentially go to jail for 20 years. So as an employer, you'll have an obligation, we think, to make sure that you're investigating, because you're the owner of the resources, either investigating the ownership structure of a potential client or just not putting people on those projects, which has its...
Yeah, exactly.
It means potentially, I mean, it's career limiting, really, for people who've already given a number of years to Australia, now suddenly find that their careers are limited.
Well, there's a lot more to go in this story. So if you're a member, keep an eye out for that email, keep an eye out for that advice. But also, no doubt, we'll talk about this in the future. We really must go. This has been another great conversation. Before we go, in our last episode, we talked about artificial intelligence quite extensively. And it's certainly an interesting topic that's taking up the mind of many business people today. I see that the UN is talking about guardrails as well as Australia. So that's something we'll talk about in future episodes. But for anyone listening, in my other AI Group podcast, Supply Circles, I recently interviewed David Fung, an expert on the implementation of AI in your business. We discussed several issues, including what can you do with a tool that looks like it can do just about everything? How can AI make my business more productive? How can AI make me more productive? It's a good chat, well worth a listen. We'll put the link in the show notes, but if you would like to request the link, just head over to our email. Louise mentioned it before, industry.policy@aigroup.com.au. Thank you for another fascinating chat, Louise. Have you got any homework for me this month?
Okay, well, since we are talking a lot, and I think about digitalisation, I think next month there'll be a bit more news around cybersecurity. So I would recommend people have a look at our cybersecurity report as well as our submission to the new cybersecurity framework. So there are 2 bits of homework for you.
And if you haven't done it yet, have a look at the budget submission, because that's a really good document to read. And no doubt we'll be talking the budget next month. Thank you very much, Louise. Well, that's it for our second episode of DBrief. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this show, remember to like and to subscribe. And please tell others about this show. And of course, if you are as opinionated as we are, please give us feedback or send a question or comment to industry.policy@aigroup.com.au. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Louise. Let's talk next month.
Thanks, James.